Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhuta Guhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarva Vide Namaha. Very good. Welcome back. We begin another new chapter today. It's unusual that these chapters are just 4 verses long. I've not seen that anywhere else, but we see that here in Upadesha, Sahasri. And Shankara, in a short span of 4 verses, can do quite a bit. And we saw that in our previous class. We'll see that again in today's class. The title of this chapter is Ishvara Atma Prakarana. Prakarana means chapter. Ishvaratma means Atma, which is Ishvara. Atma, which is identical to Ishvara, non-separate from Ishvara. And this is an expression we might not be used to, because we are very much accustomed to understanding Ishvara as a creator, sustainer, destroyer, and we understand ourselves as limited, finite beings. But here, two things are happening in this chapter, as we will see. One is that Shankara wants to negate any possibility of thinking that Ishvara is remote, distant, beyond. He wants to establish the fact that Ishvara is here now as the reality because of which everything exists, as a reality because of which you exist. The idea of a remote God is common in biblical tradition. So Allah is separate. Christians pray, "Our Father who art in heaven." Heaven is a distant place. So Shankara, first and foremost, wants to establish the fact that Ishvara is not remote in any way whatsoever. But he's going to take this in a deeper manner by using the truth that Ishvara, in fact, is Brahman. And we need to explain this a little bit. Before I do, let me just comment that there are some teachers of Vedanta, traditional teachers of Vedanta, who interchangeably use the words Ishvara and Brahman. Now, you notice I never do, because to me it seems a little confusing. But Sureshwaracharya, who was Shankara's senior most disciple, he actually used Ishvara and Brahman interchangeably. And that seems very strange, because we understand Ishvara as creator, sustainer, destroyer. We understand Brahman as a nirguna, an attribute-less underlying reality. So it seems strange at first until you understand what is the meaning of the Mahavakya. So bear in mind, these are great teachers like Sureshwara and Shankara, and they can very easily understand the fact that Ishvara is Brahman. Just as when I say you are sat-chit-ananda Atma, is that understandable? Of course it is. Because you know, when I say you, I'm not referring to your body, mind, and senses. I'm referring to your true nature. So when I say you are sat-chit-ananda Atma, it's meaningful. So when Shankara or Sureshwara says Ishvara is Brahman, it's a parallel statement. You are sat-chit-ananda atma, you quickly discern what I intend by that statement. In the same way, when Shankara or Sureshwara says Ishvara is Brahman, they presume that you can discern that creator, sustainer, destroyer are tangential attributes and are not fundamentally real. The reality of you is Atma. The reality of Ishvara is Brahman. So be ready for that in this chapter. The word Ishvara is used as Brahman. That's something we're not accustomed to, but it is done in traditional teachings of Advaita Vedanta. So we need to be alert to this particular usage. So with that introduction, let us begin. Ishvaraschedanatmasyan, Ishvaraschedanatmasyan, nasava asmiti dharayet, nasavasmiti dharayet, atma-chedishvarosmiti, atma-chedishvarosmiti, vidya sanya nivartika, vidya sanya vinvartika. Chet. Ishvara chet. Chet. If Ishvara is anatma. Syat is a potential verb, would be. If Ishvara chet syat, if it happens to be, that Ishvara is anatma. Now again here, Ishvara is not used in the sense of creator, sustainer, destroyer. In fact, let me share with you the exact words that our commentator, Ramatirtha, he explains. He says, Ishvara jagat karana tvena upalakshitaha paramatma. Satya jnanananta ananda rupaha. So he says Ishvara is Paramatma. Most of you know Paramatma is a synonym for Brahman. If Atma means your individual consciousness, Paramatma is transcending that individuality of your consciousness, leading us to Brahman. So Ishvara is Paramatma, Brahman, which he then says is Satya Jnana Ananta Ananda Rupaha. The typical expression, Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma. This is a famous statement in the Taittiriya Upanishad. So he's defining here that Ishvara is Paramatma, Paramatma is Brahman, but here's the key. Jagat Karana Tvena Upalakshitaha. Upalakshitaha, tangentially referred to as Jagat Karana Tvena, as the cause for the world. Upalakshita, referred to as the creator of the universe. Notice he uses that word referred to. He doesn't say that Ishvara is Jagat Karana. He says Ishvara is referred to here as Jagat Karana. And why does he make that subtle distinction? Because he's using the word Ishvara in this unusual way here. He really is using Ishvara, the word, to mean Brahman. So that we have to understand. And again, yes, it's unusual, but it's not unheard of. We see it here, and in the works of Sureshwara, it's not uncommon. So we need to get used to that a little bit. Okay, that being said, so Ishvara chet anatma syat, if Ishvara is truly different from Atma, na asau asmi iti dharayet, then iti dharayet, one could not ascertain asau asmi iti. I am that. Asau, you have to break the words apart. Na asau asmi iti. If Ishvara is truly different from, separate from Atma, then how can you understand I am that? Now brings us right to the Mahavakya, Tattvamasi. Now this is what we've plunged right into here is actually the highest teachings of Advaita Vedanta. So this is no ordinary subject matter. Here we are only in chapter 3, and Shankara is referring to the Mahavakya fairly casually, presuming that you've already thoroughly analyzed and understood the Mahavakya. Let us spend a few minutes now and understand what that Mahavakya is and how it works. So, tat tvam asi, you are that. How does that Mahavakya work? And let me give you a metaphor first, and then I'll go to the board and show you in more detail. So the Mahavakya wants to reveal, by the way, in the Mahavakya, tat means Ishvara, and tvam means jiva at the surface level. And you might say, well, wait a minute, how can Ishvara be the same as jiva? That doesn't seem to be an equality at all. Ishvara is a creator of the universe. I'm a creator of a mess in the kitchen. So there's a huge disparity there. How do we reconcile that? And there is an underlying identity that's revealed by the Mahavakya. Let me show you first by analogy, and then I'll go to the board. So we have here a little pot space, and we have around us infinite space. If I say pot space is infinite space, on the surface that doesn't make any sense. This pot space is quite small, just several cubic inches. Infinite space is infinite. Well, how can pot space be identical to infinite space on the surface? It doesn't look like it matches at all. Until we understand that pot space is nothing but space, something you've understood before. This pot doesn't truly delimit space, doesn't truly confine space. It seems to, but space has no edges or boundaries. You can't chop space up into little bits and pieces because space is not a physical thing that can be divided up. You can divide up, if you're cutting a cucumber, you can chop it up into bits. Space is not like a cucumber. I don't know, why do I have these kitchen metaphors today? I have no idea. Anyway. So, the way we understand that pot space is infinite space is by negating the pot. And we have a technical word for this pot. We have to remember its usage. We've taught it before, upadhi. This pot is an upadhi. Upadhi is a very important technical term used in Advaita Vedanta, usually translated as limiting adjunct. I'm not sure if that's any help. Limiting adjunct, the idea is that the form of pot makes infinite space seem limited. The form of the pot makes infinite space seem limited. That which causes a seeming limitation is upadhi. That which causes an apparent limitation, not a real limitation, that which causes an apparent limitation is called Upadhi. We need to know that word. Now I can go to the board and show you in more detail. Where's the board? Here we go. So here's how the Mahavakya works. And by the way, there are entire texts devoted to what I'm about to show you. Shankara wrote a Vakya Vritti text. There's also a shorter form, Laghu Vakya Vritti, entire texts devoted to understanding the Mahavakya. You get the idea, it's an important subject matter. So let us see the contents in brief of what those books say. This word asi is functionally an equal sign. You are that. So let me put the equal sign here. So tat equals tvam. On the surface, tat means Ishvara, and tvam equals jiva, the one sitting in your chair. And when we put this here, we can't really say equals. We just have to say not equal. Jiva is not equal to Ishvara. You're sitting on your chair. Ishvara fills the cosmos. Where is the equality here? There is none at this level. So we have to deconstruct this. Remember in algebra, you would break things down into different expressions. How about this? Ishvara is Brahman plus an upadhi. So there's our word that we just introduced. Upadhi, is this out on board? Yes, good. So here, upadhi, limiting adjunct, that which makes Brahman appear to be the creator, sustainer, destroyer. So the status of being creator, sustainer, destroyer is an upadhi. When we combine that state, Brahman is not creator, sustainer, destroyer, as you've understood from other classes. Brahman has no gunas, no qualities. To be a creator, a sustainer, and a destroyer are qualities. Brahman is nirguna. Nirguna means no qualities. No qualities means not a creator, sustainer, destroyer. But Ishvara is creator, sustainer, destroyer. So Ishvara exists because of Brahman. Everything exists because of Brahman. But Brahman alone cannot be responsible for the world of names and forms. There must be another factor. So just as the pot was another factor that made space look different than what it truly is, and the pot being an upadhi makes space look limited. In the same way, there is an upadhi which makes Brahman gain the status of creator, sustainer, destroyer. Now, we could spend weeks talking about what that upadhi is, but that'll distract us from what we want to accomplish here. So let's just say this upadhi, and I know this is fairly abstract, but I think you get it. Whatever is required to make nirguna Brahman attain the status of creator, sustainer, destroyer, that's the upadhi. And jiva, this is a little bit easier, is, phone please. 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 Thank you. All right. This will be a little bit easier to work with. Jiva, you, the one sitting in your chair, is sat-chit-ananda atma, consciousness, your true self, plus Nupadi. Here, Upadi is pretty obvious. It's the one sitting in your chair. The physical body and the mind and intellect and senses and prana that inhabit your body. So the physicality, the form, mind, body, mind, and senses, we can say, form your Upadi. And notice this is a pretty clear example, a pretty clear description of who you are. We can't say you are only sat-chit-ananda atma. How do we explain the one sitting in your chair? Nor can we say you are only the one sitting in your chair, because the truth of you is sat-chit-ananda atma. So we have these two factors involved in defining who you are. And when we have this equation, it's still not equals. Because you, the one sitting in your chair, the conscious being with your limited body, mind, sense complex, is not identical to Brahman, who has attained the status of being creator, sustainer, destroyer. And I'll just remind you, this is the highest teaching of Advaita Vedanta. If this seems sophisticated to you, there's nothing more sophisticated. There's nothing higher in the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. So just relax and do your best to understand this, but recognizing what we're seeing this morning is really an extraordinary teaching, truly the highest teaching of Advaita Vedanta. Now, how do we resolve this inequality? Because clearly we have an inequality. How do we resolve it? And the way we resolve it is we understand that, coming back to our pot, I need the prop. I don't think I could teach without a pot and a crystal. They're like essential teaching tools. Anyway, so many times we've discussed this pot and we've understand, pardon my American English, there ain't no pot. It's clay, and it's nothing but clay. And you've heard me say before, if this is 4 ounces of clay, how much does a pot add to that 4 ounces? Pot is not a thing. Pot is a form, nama, rupa, name and form. The thing is clay. We've had this discussion so many times. What that means then is that the reality is clay. Pot is not as real as clay. It doesn't count. 4 ounces of clay counts. Pot doesn't count. It's not 4 ounces plus something. Or it's 4 ounces of clay plus 0. That makes sense? We have 4 ounces. The clay accounts for 4 ounces. Pot accounts for 0. Make sense? Watch this. Atma accounts for who you are in a fundamental sense. How much does your body account for? Now, don't tell me the weight of your body. That's not the metaphor here. But the point I'm making is, just as the pot is not as real as clay, therefore it doesn't count, your body, mind, and senses is not as real as sat-chit-ananda atma, your true self. Your body, mind, and senses are a container, like the pot. And they add nothing to your existence as a conscious being. You are a conscious being. By the way, conscious being is shorthand for sat-chit-ananda atma. You are a conscious being, utterly independent body, mind, and senses. You would exist perfectly fine without your body. In fact, before your birth, before the birth of your body, you existed. After your body falls, you exist. So the truth of who you are is sat-chit-ananda atma, consciousness, and your body, mind, and senses add nothing because they're not as real. I think that metaphor of container is perfect. Just as this pot is a container for space, in the same way, let us call your body and mind a container for consciousness. The pot adds nothing to the clay, and this upadhi adds nothing to who you are. In the same way here, Brahman is the underlying reality. Brahman alone is real. Everything else falls into the category of name and form. Again, this is a topic that we could spend weeks talking about. We have to skip it here. Point is that if we could think of this upadhi also as a container. There's a small container because of which you become a jiva. There's a huge container because of which Brahman becomes creator, sustainer, destroyer. Your body sits in your chair. Ishvara's body, if we want to talk about it, is the entire cosmos. So, just as you have a finite container filled with consciousness, Ishvara is an infinite container. Nice metaphor? You have a finite container filled with consciousness. Ishvara has an infinite container, and the underlying reality because of which Ishvara exists is Brahman. The container is like the pot, adds nothing to the clay. This container is not as real as Brahman, so we zero it out. Now we have our final equation. Brahman plus 0, Atma plus 0, we finally have our equality. This is how the Mahavakya works. Like I said, there are entire texts devoted to what I've just shown you in 10 minutes. So if this topic seems a little bit sophisticated, as I said before, these are the highest teachings of Advaita Vedanta. This is how the equality is discovered through a process of negation. Notice the last chapter we saw? Negation. So that principle of negation continues in this chapter in a different way. Okay, enough. Now we can understand what Shankara is teaching here. He really has opened up this chapter with this huge teaching. So first half he says, if Ishvara is truly different than Atma, then one could never understand I am that. The Mahavakya, Tattvamasi, would be meaningless if the Mahavakya would be I'm thinking if I want to talk about this or not here. Oh, wait. The Mahavakya, actually, that's not that point comes in the next verse. Let me correct myself. So, if Ishvara were truly separate from and different from Atma, then the Mahavakya would not lead you to discover your identity. The Mahavakya analysis we just went through would be meaningless and helpless. So you would continue to think, Ishvara is Ishvara, I'm this finite little critter living on this planet, trying to eke out a little bit of happiness here and there, that would be where you're left. But Shankara gives the flip side. Atma chet ishvaraha asmi iti. He says chet, if one, there's chet again, if one understands ishvaraha asmi iti, if one understands I am not different, I am not separate from Ishvara, I being Atma, my true self, is not separate from Ishvara, then vidya, in the last line, that knowledge, sa vidya, that knowledge, anya nivartika, removes the sense of otherness. This knowledge removes the sense of otherness if there truly is an identity. Let me just go back to the board just to make sure that's clear. If we start off with tat not equals twam, then we don't even begin this analysis, right? That's the first half of the verse. If Atma is truly different from Ishvara, then it's just different. So if this is an inequality, if the Mahavakya were tat tvam nasi, you are not that, then go home and eat some potato chips. I don't know. These teachings won't help you if the Mahavakya is tat tvam nasi. So, second half, if Ishvara is truly the same as Atma, and this is the unusual factor. Remember, he's using the word Ishvara in the sense of Brahman here. So when he says, if Ishvara is in fact identical to Atma, what he's saying is if Brahman is identical to Atma. And that's exactly what the Mahavakya reveals. So this is the tricky part. We have to know that Shankara is using Ishvara in the sense of Brahman here. So if Ishvara is the same as Atma, if Brahman is the same as Atma, then this Mahavakya, properly applied, leads to knowledge of your identity. That's the point of this first verse. Okay, let's continue. Atmanon yasya ched dharma, Atmanon yasya ched dharma, astulattvadayo mataha, astulattvadayo mataha, agneyatvesya kem taisyad, agneyatvesya kem taisyad, syaratmatve syaratmatve tvanyadhi hnutihi, syaratmatve tvanyadhi, sorry. Tu anyadhi hnutihi. I'll explain the words in just a moment. So notice he uses this chet again, if. Philosophers have a fancy word for this. Contrary hypothetical. How's that? That'll break your head. A contrary hypothetical means a hypothetical proposition that is false. Okay, he says, chet, if atmanaha anyasya, if other than Atma, Dharmaha mataha. You have to connect those two words. Dharmas. Here, dharma means quality. Be ready for that. Dharma often means quality. We say the dharma of water is coolness and wetness. That's a common word, common meaning of the word dharma in a philosophical context. In religious context, it'll have different meanings. But here, in this philosophical context, dharma means a quality. So, dharmaha mataha. There are qualities that are mataha, understood, qualities that are taught in scriptures, qualities like what? Astula twadaya, astula twat, astulya twadayaha mataha, astula twa adi. Adi means etc. Astula twa adayaha. Qualities like not stula, not physical. This is actually a quotation of the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. It's often quoted, and let me just share with you the original text so you get a little better sense of that. Then we'll make sense out of the whole verse. So in the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, we find this description of Brahman. Brahman is described as astulam, not physical. Ananu, not microscopic. Ahraswam, not short. Adhirgam, not long. Alohitam, not red. Asneham, not sticky. That's what it says. Achayam, not shadowy. Atamas, not dark. Avayu, not like air. Anakasham, not like space. Asangam, detached. Arasam, not something you can taste. Agandham, not something you can smell. Chakshushkam, not something you can see. Shrotram, nothing you can hear. And it goes on like this. Negation, negation, and more negation. So that's our topic from the last chapter. That's the topic that continues here, negation. So he is saying here, in the scriptures, like Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, we find these dharmaha, mataha, these qualities are taught. So astula, not physical, is it's funny to call it a quality, right? Because it's actually negating a quality, but Shankara calls them qualities here. So this teaching is taught, and it is taught agnyayatve, with regard to Ishvara, which is agnyaya, currently unknown. So the scriptural teachings, agnyayatve, with regard to Ishvara, and again, Ishvara means Brahman, right? So when that whole list I just mentioned to you, astula, anu, that which is not physical, that which is not microscopic, these are words used to describe Brahman, not Ishvara. So again, Shankara continues to use the word Ishvara to mean Brahman. So if these scriptural words are used with regard to Ishvara, which might be unknown, if they are used for Ishvara, and Ishvara who is atmanaha anyasya, first two words, and Ishvara which is separate, anya, and Ishvara which is separate from Atma, if the scripture uses these words like not physical with regard to Ishvara, who is if that Ishvara is truly separate from Atma, then Shankara says, Kim taihi syat? Then what purpose would they serve? So here we have to understand Shankara's line of reasoning. And this is an important point. Shankara here says how to say this? Shankara gives the benefit of the doubt to the scripture. So the scripture says, tat tvam asi, but suppose you think, no, tat is not tvam. Tat tvam nasi is your contention. Shankara would say, wait a minute, you have to give the benefit of the doubt to the scripture, to the shastra. Why? Shastra is atma-vichara. These are the statements of the rishis, the wisdom of the rishis, living human beings like you and me who personally discovered these truths. So it's not like someone made this up. The scriptures are a record of the teachings of these ancient rishis. These rishis taught what they discovered. Those teachings are compiled in the Vedas. Shankara gives the benefit of the doubt to these scriptural teachings, meaning on the surface, reasoning seems to be in conflict with Scripture. Isn't that what we saw on the board? On the surface, look at the board. On the surface, Ishvara not equal jiva is reasoning. Tat equals tvam is Scripture. So here in the first two lines, tat equals tvam is scripture, Ishvara not equals jiva is reasoning. We see an apparent conflict between scripture and reasoning. This will give you some insight into how Shankara thinks. When you see an apparent conflict between scripture and reasoning, which should you give up? So if you give up tattvamasi, then as I said, you go home and eat potato chips. The other option is to re-examine your reasoning. And that's what's on the board, is a re-examination of the reasoning. So this is how Shankara thinks. If Shastra and reasoning are in conflict, we have to re-examine the reasoning. Notice on the board, we didn't abandon reasoning, right? Never was abandoned. We re-examined our initial assumptions. And through that process of re-examination, we came finally to understand that the scripture is indeed reasonable. That's crucial. Because Shankara feels strongly, any scripture, there are two sides. One is Shankara here gives a benefit of the doubt to the scripture. As we just said, if the scripture looks unreasonable, re-examine your reasoning. But Shankara also rejects the blind acceptance of scripture. He is famous for the statement, if 1,000 scriptures say fire is cold, Shankara says he'll reject every one of those scriptures. So notice his position on scripture is highly nuanced. So he gives it the benefit of the doubt without blindly accepting scripture. And allow me just a little aside here. What a powerful and nuanced approach to scriptures. How refreshing and different it is from conventional scriptural study. Our Christian friends and Muslim friends who hold on to every word of the scripture and just believe it and accept it blindly. So Shankara's approach is so radically different. As I said, highly nuanced. Okay, that being said, let's finish this up. So Shankara says, I'll paraphrase the first 3 lines for you. Shankara says, if the scriptural statements Like Brahman is not physical, Brahman is not microscopic, Brahman is not this, not that, not this, not that. If those scriptural statements with regard to Ishvara are with regard to an Ishvara who is other than Atma. That's the whole topic of this chapter. Atma is not separate from Ishvara. But here he's using that ch3, if. If Atma truly is separate and different from Ishvara, then he says, what's the purpose of the scripture? Meaning he gives benefit of the doubt to scripture. On the other hand, second line, last line, syat, if it happens to be that those statements in the scripture are atma-tve, are actually with regard to Atma. The statements of negation. If all the negation in the scriptures are actually used to show that Atma is non-different from Ishvara. And that's what we did on the board. We used negation to show the equality, the equivalence. So here, Shankara is saying, come back here, if those scriptures are properly used to negate the apparent differences, like if we negate the apparent difference between pot space and infinite space. So if we use these scriptural negations to negate the apparent differences between Jiva and Ishvara, he says, tu anyadhi hnutihi, tu, then anyadhi, the conclusion of otherness, hnutihi, removal. Those statements lead to the removal of the conclusion of otherness. Ishvara is out there, our Father who art in heaven. So that sense of otherness is negated through these scriptural negations, is what he wants to say. The last two verses finish the chapter, and they're almost the same in meaning. Let's just go ahead and see them. Mityadhyasa nishedhartam, mityadhyasa nishedhartam, tatostuladi grihyatam, tatostuladi grihyatam, paratrachen nishedhartam, paratrachen nishedhartam, shunyata varanam hitata, shunyata varanam hitata. Tataha, in the second line, therefore, stuladi, referring to that Brihadaranyaka passage that I quoted, all the negation. So stuladi means scriptural negation. So all this scriptural negation, grihyatam, should be understood. Should be understood how? First line, mithya adhyasa nishedha artam. All this negation is nishedhartam for the sake of negating mithya adhyasa, false attribution. And Shankara is being very technical here, but the meaning is actually not very complex. This is not a pot. That is a term of negation, and what it's negating is a false, actually, let me rephrase. This pot space is limitless. That's my statement. This pot space is limitless. How do we get there? By negating the false mithya adhyasa, false attribution. We negate the false attribution of potness to space. Does space have potness? Space has no attributes. Space certainly doesn't possess potness. But when we call this pot space, aren't we attributing potness to space? False attribution. Mithya adhyasa. And Shankara is famous for this particular kind of analysis. This is the analysis that's found in his introduction to the Brahma Sutra. He has a famous introduction to the Brahma Sutra in which he discusses at great length this false attribution. We falsely attribute potness to space. You falsely attribute physicality to your true self. That's the false attribution. Space has no potness. Your true self has no physicality. Due to ignorance, we falsely attribute potness to space. Due to ignorance, we falsely attribute physicality to sat-chit-ananda, atma, your true self. Paratra chain, the shedhartam, Shankara continues with his contrary hypotheticals, his use of this if. So if, on the other hand, this negation, nishedhartam, if this negation were paratra with regard to something other than atma, shunyata varanam hitata. He says, that would be varanam, a description of shunyata, absolute non-existence. Now, these are very sophisticated teachings. Let me make it but they're not that hard to grasp. Let me make it clear. We use this process of negation with regard to atma. And this is our whole topic. The whole last class was on that very point. We use negation to reveal the true nature of atma. So in the last half, Shankara posits, suppose you try to use negation to understand something other than atma. Shankara says, suppose. Suppose you try to define an elephant through a process of negation. Will it work? We discussed that in the last class, and we saw it won't work. But I want to make it more clear why it won't work. So to define an elephant through a process of negation is impossible. Only atma can be discovered through a process of negation. And let me show you why. There is such a thing as chit, consciousness, and jada, that which is inert. These are the two realities that exist. Everything is either consciousness or inert, not conscious. There's no third category, right? Everything is either consciousness or other than consciousness. That is, to go back to our last class, knower, and our Bhagavad Gita class, there's knower and known, kshetrajna and kshetra, or purusha and prakriti. Many of you are attending the Bhagavad Gita classes. So we have these two categories. They are obviously non-overlapping entities. Do you remember in learning something about Venn diagrams? These are Venn diagrams. This shows this represents consciousness. This represents that which is not consciousness, that which is jada, that which is inert. What we saw in our last class is that the process of negation is done from the standpoint of consciousness, right? The consciousness of the one doing the negation. So negation takes place here in the realm of chit. And then, therefore, what is negated is outside the realm of chit, which means jada. So this is our last class. From the standpoint of chit, we negated all that was jada. And when jada is gone, all that remains is chit. Remember in our last class, chit sheshitam. What remains, sheshitam, what remains is only that consciousness. Now here, Shankara is having fun with logic. Not only, but Shankara is such a genius that he enjoys all of this logic stuff. Let me show you the logic that Shankara is enjoying here. He says, suppose this process of negation was with regard not to consciousness, but he says anatma, with regard to something other, anya, he uses. He says, suppose you use that process of negation with regard to something other than atma. Here, jada. Which means there is he's adopting a standpoint in which there is no chit, there is only jada. You do the negation, and when you do the negation, what do you end up with? Shunya. You end up with absolutely nothing. So Shankara is using this logic, pure logic, to make a point. And he says that if you attempt to use this strategy of negation to try to understand anything other than Atma, you'll end up negating everything without exception. Nothing will be left over. What you will arrive at is shunyata, nothingness. And Shankara restates that in this last verse. We'll see that. Bhubutsor yadi chan yatra, bhubutsor yadi chan yatra, pratyagatmana hishyate, pratyagatmana hishyate, aprano hyamana shubhra, aprano hyamana shubhra, iti chanarthakam vachaha, iti chanarthakam yataha. Basically, he restates what he just said in a previous verse. He says, bubutsoho, for a spiritual seeker, that's what it means in this context, it can mean other things. Bubutsoho, for a spiritual seeker, yadi, if pratyagat manaha anyatra, you have to break apart, cha anyatra, ishyate. If the scriptures ishyate had intended to teach something pratyagatmanaha anyatra, other than Atma. So it's restating what we just saw. If the scriptural negations were indeed with regard to something other than Atma, then, Shankara says, scriptural, then iti cha anarthakam vachaha, then other scriptural statements would become meaningless. Vachaha, scriptural statements, anarthakam, meaningless, they would be meaningless. What kind of scriptural statements? Now here he is quoting from the Mundaka Upanishad, another famous statement, where reality is described as, in fact, Atma is described as apranaha, not having prana, life. He, indeed, amanaha, not having a mind. Atma is described here as aprana, independent of the life force, amanaha, independent of mind, so independent of the body, mind, sense complex. But one more word is used here. Shubhraha, consciousness. So here we see, side by side, two words of negation, a pranaha, a manaha, and one word, shubhra, means shining. And that shining refers to consciousness. Let me go back to the board and show you how Shankara has returned. And just stopped working. There we go. All right. So remember, we're back. I erased it already, but remember this diagram, chit and jada. So Shankara says here that he's quoting from that Mundaka Upanishad. Mundaka Upanishad says, what is Atma? Atma is a prana, negating. Prana is part of chit or part of jada. Jada. So Atma is a pranaha. It is not the life force that enlivens your body. And Atma is a manaha. It is not mind. And these two words really refer to your whole body, mind, sense complex. So these two words then negate jada. And what is left, shubhraha, that which is shining consciousness is left. So this is a very, very sophisticated approach Shankara is using here to show how this negation works. And we'll just make a couple of concluding remarks here and wind up our class. Most philosophers would deny that negation can establish anything. And in general, they're true. They're correct. You can't define an elephant through a process of negation. You can't define any worldly reality through a process of negation. This is well known to philosophers around the world. Yet, Vedanta seizes on this process of negation as the primary methodology. There are many other methods used, but this process of negation is truly the main method used in Vedanta. And if there's any error or flaw in that method, then the entire teachings of Vedanta are useless. So Shankara is working very hard in this chapter to analyze how this process of negation actually leads to the discovery of a truth, of a profound truth. And it can do so for the reason when we saw, you negate jada, what remains is chit. So Shankara spends this I can say entire chapter, but it's only 4 verses. Shankara is working very hard then at showing the validity of this strategy, this methodology of negation. And I mentioned in a prior class, it's unique. You won't find it in any other, at least I've not seen it used in Western philosophy. I studied some Western philosophy long ago, did a fairly thorough review of Western philosophy, and of course Buddhist traditions, other traditions. This particular kind of methodology is unique, it is brilliant, and Shankara has gone to great lengths here to give it a very solid foundation so that it becomes an unshakable and unquestionable methodology. Okay, we'll conclude with our prayers, and then we'll go to the next chapter next week. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sad gamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityorma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.